Frozen echoes of the Ardennes. The snow had a way of swallowing sound, muting everything but the rasp of breath and the crunch of boots. December had sunk its teeth deep into the Ardennes, and we were nothing more than shapes in the whiteness, hunched and half-buried in the narrow trenches we clawed into the frozen soil. Somewhere behind the tree line, a single rifle crack echoed, distant, almost harmless. But we knew better. I remember the cold before anything else. It wasn't just the bite on your fingers or the sting on your face. It sank deeper. Into the bones. Into the mind. Like a whisper reminding you that your body was failing. My toes had gone numb days earlier, and the stiff leather of my boots felt like coffins for my feet. Men whispered rumors, a shipment of dry socks, a crate of canned beef, but nothing came. The snow piled higher, and the wind cut sharper, until even the Germans fell silent on the other side of the woods. Silence was the worst. After the shelling, after the blast had stopped punching holes through the earth and men alike, it felt unnatural. Like the world itself had drawn breath and was waiting, just waiting. Those were the moments when memory crept back, unwanted. The moments when I heard voices. Distant, layered in the cracks and whispers of the forest. Frankie's voice, too young, too sharp, from before he'd stopped speaking altogether. My mother's calling me home for supper back in Indiana, the way she used to before Pa lost the farm. And then there were the other voices, the ones I didn't recognize. Low, murmuring things that blended with the wind. I told myself it was just the forest settling, just the ice creaking on the branches. But at night, when the frost turned our breath to pale ghosts and the sky glowed faintly with gunfire, I could swear they were calling names I should have known. I dug my foxhole deeper, closer to the roots, closer to the earth that felt warm, almost protective compared to the relentless ice above. We'd been told to hold. Hold against what? The Germans had gone quiet. Their artillery had ceased, save for the occasional probing barrage, as if testing our nerves. The lieutenant was long dead, and the last orders we'd received were garbled. Hold the line, hold your ground, no retreat. But the ground had become our grave, and the line blurred with the snow. It was on the third day of the quiet when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow. A shadow moving where there shouldn't have been one, just beyond the tree line where the fog clung low and thick. The figure emerged slowly, half obscured, a shape in the white stillness, moving with a careful, deliberate step. A German. Or so I thought. The helmet looked wrong, too rounded, almost like the old Great War patterns they showed us in training. His coat hung long and heavy, dragging at the hem as though soaked through. He wasn't aiming a rifle. His hands, pale as the frost, hung slack at his sides. I raised my garrant, heart pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. Breath fogged the air. One step closer. Another. He was within 50 yards when he stopped, head tilting slightly. Not scanning. Listening. And then he turned. No warning, no haste, and faded back into the trees. For the first time in days, I felt warmth in my fingers, a sudden pulse of heat as adrenaline hit. No gunshot. No call for surrender. Just that silent retreat into the woods. I stayed there, frozen in place, long after he disappeared. Later, I told Peters about it, the only man left in the foxhole beside me. His face was pale beneath the grime and stubble, and when he spoke, his voice cracked. You didn't see anyone. The Jerrys have been gone for days. Frost's getting to your head, buddy. But that night, I heard it again. The sound of boots crunching lightly over the ice. Closer this time. It wasn't until dawn that I noticed the footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Tracks leading from the woods straight toward our line. Then vanishing. By the fifth day, the cold was killing us more surely than any shell fire. We ran out of rations, and the frostbite spread like rot through the men still clinging to life in the foxholes. Peter's right hand had gone black at the fingertips. He started muttering about things that didn't make sense, about whispers in the trees, about how he could hear his sister's voice calling from the other side of the woods. You hear it too, right? He rasped that morning, voice thin as a crack in glass. I didn't answer, because I did hear it, and part of me wanted to follow. The next morning, the snow had crusted over, a brittle layer that crunched underfoot as I crawled out of the foxhole. The footprints were still there, pale impressions against the frozen ground, too delicate to belong to a soldier, too defined for the snow to have simply shaped them. They led toward the tree line, ending abruptly as though the figure had dissolved into the fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made them was watching, lingering just beyond the veil of frost. Peters hadn't moved all night. His breath came ragged, eyes half closed. His blackened fingers curled against his chest like dead twigs. I tried speaking to him, shaking his shoulder gently, but he only muttered something under his breath, a name I didn't recognize, Annie, repeated over and over like a mantra. I left him there, hunched beneath the ice-crusted blanket, and climbed the shallow ridge above our trench. The forest was too quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that pressed on your ears, making you aware of the faintest creak of branches, the shifting of snow. Somewhere deep in those woods, artillery had torn apart whole trees days earlier, yet now the place looked untouched, the snow lying clean and perfect across the broken earth. The silence played tricks on the mind. I could almost hear voices drifting in the wind, faint but familiar, as though calling me from some far-off place I could no longer name. Indiana, maybe, or a memory of it. By midday, Peters stopped speaking. His skin had gone waxy, pale except for the places frostbite had bloomed. I thought about what we'd been told in basic, how cold could make a man fall asleep forever, slipping away so gently it felt more like surrender than death. I checked his pulse twice, felt nothing, but I stayed there beside him long after he'd stopped moving, afraid to be alone in that trench with the snow piling higher. The hunger came in waves, but worse than the ache in my stomach was the feeling of being forgotten. No radio crackled. No planes passed overhead. The shells hadn't fallen in days. It was as if the war had moved on, leaving us behind, buried under the frost. Night came early, the sky low and heavy with pale clouds that reflected the dying glow of distant gunfire. I sat with my back against the frozen dirt, gripping my rifle not from readiness but for the weak comfort of its weight. That's when I heard it again. The boots crunching lightly over the snow, slow, measured steps. This time the figure came closer. I saw him clear. He wasn't a German, not in the way I'd first thought. The coat wasn't regulation. It looked older, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs of men who'd fought long before this war. His face was pale, almost colorless in the dim light, and his eyes were hollow, the whites almost blending into the frost. He didn't speak, didn't raise a weapon. He only watched, and for a long moment I thought he was going to step closer. Then, without warning, he turned, the same as before, and drifted back toward the trees. But this time he left something behind. A single boot print, half melted where he'd stood, the snow beneath damp and dark. I stared at that single footprint long after the figure had vanished, as if expecting it to dissolve along with him. But it remained, pressed deep into the frost, the edges slowly hardening under the night's bitter chill. Something about it felt wrong, and not just because it shouldn't have been there. The snow hadn't disturbed where he'd come from, no trail leading toward the trench, just that single mark where he had stood. I crouched closer, squinting in a dim half-light, and noticed the strangest thing. The melted outline wasn't steaming from heat. It was as though the frost itself had recoiled, retreating from the shape. The hunger clawed deeper the next morning, gnawing dull and constant beneath my ribs. My stomach felt shrunken, the ache fading into something heavier, more permanent. I couldn't remember the last real meal. The rations had run out days ago, and the snow was too thick to search the frozen bodies lying just beyond the foxholes. Peters was still slumped in the corner, his face pale as the frost, his frozen lips parted slightly. I kept catching myself glancing at him, waiting for the slight rise of his chest, the sound of a breath, but nothing came. He was gone. I told myself I needed to bury him. That was the decent thing to do, wasn't it? But the ground was ice-packed and bitter, and the shovel felt heavier than it should have. I would do it tomorrow. Tomorrow when the snow stopped. But the snow never stopped. By the fourth day, the trench felt like a coffin. The air thick with the sour tang of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and something worse, the scent of death creeping closer with each frozen breath. My thoughts grew slow, heavy like my limbs. I kept replaying that moment, the figure in the snow, the way he watched. What was he? A deserter? A ghost? The lines between memory and fever blurred. At night, I thought I heard him moving along the edge of the trees, the soft sound of boots pressing the frost, stopping just where the fog turned thickest. And always, there was that voice, soft, whispering, half-formed words in the wind. Not German, not English, but familiar. On the fifth night, something changed. I woke to the sound of cracking ice, louder this time, sharp like a branch splitting underweight. The fog was thicker than ever, so dense it rolled into the trench itself, coiling along the edges of the frozen earth. I could hear the footsteps again, closer. But this time, there were more of them. Not one pair. 3, maybe 4. Moving in slow, deliberate patterns just beyond the ridge. I reached for my rifle, but my fingers were so stiff, so numb it took effort just to close them around the stock. Breath came shallow, fogging in the air before me. A shape emerged, taller than the first, and behind it, another. I tried to rise, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, trembling under the weight of exhaustion and frostbite. The taller figure stepped closer, not speaking, just watching. And in that moment, something shifted. The snow behind them, there were no footprints. Only the untouched whiteness, clean and perfect as if nothing living had passed through. I should have run. I should have raised my rifle, pulled the trigger, done something, anything, but the cold had stolen that instinct. The taller figure lingered, half shrouded by fog, while the others stood further back, barely more than silhouettes pressed against the pale haze. They watched, silent, unmoving, their eyes as hollow as the frostbite gnawing at my skin. My pulse slowed, a dull drumbeat echoing in my ears, and for a moment, the snow didn't feel as cold. The hunger didn't feel as sharp. It was as if the world itself had numbed, slipping further and further from reality, sinking into something quieter. And then, from behind me, Peter's voice. Only it couldn't have been Peter's. Peter's was dead, stiff as the earth behind me, his skin as pale as the snow. But the voice came just the same, hoarse and broken. "Annie? You?" I turned too quickly, dizzy with the sudden movement. There he was, half sitting, slumped against the trench wall, his frozen eyes open, unseeing, lips cracked and blue, but moving. Moving as if trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I scrambled back, heart pounding so loud I thought it might break the stillness. When I looked up again, the figures in the fog were gone. The snow had settled, the frost swirling in soft gusts, as though nothing unnatural had ever disturbed it. But Peter's lips were still moving. I don't remember how long I stayed like that, half kneeling in the frost, my breath coming short and ragged. My mind spun in slow, fragmented loops, replaying the moments, Peter's voice, the watchers in the snow. What were they waiting for? Why hadn't they? A low groaning echoed through the trees then. Not the wind. Not the ice shifting. Something deeper. A sound that seemed to rise from the ground itself, as if the earth beneath us were cracking open. And Peter's, his face twisted, lips trembling, but now there were words. Clear this time. Don't follow them. I didn't sleep that night. The fog lingered well into the morning, pressing low over the treetops, and when it finally thinned, the snow was different. Too smooth. Too perfect. No prints. No sign of the figures. But there was something left behind, barely visible near the tree lean, half buried under the ice. A single photograph. Fingers shaking, I brushed the frost away. It was old, worn at the edges, black and white. A young woman standing on a porch, head tilted just slightly, smiling in that way people do when they don't know they're being watched. There was handwriting on the back, faded but legible. Annie, Christmas, 1940. Peter's sister. But the snow where I found it wasn't just frost. It was red. The stain bled through the frost in a slow spreading bloom, darkening the edges of the photograph as if the ice itself were rejecting it. At first, I thought it might be some trick of light, the way dawn sometimes painted the snow with pale hues. But no. This was deeper, richer. I knelt, pressing gloved fingers to it, and they came away damp, warm. Not the frozen crust of old wounds or forgotten violence. Fresh blood. Too fresh for this place where everything was frozen solid. The thought gripped me with a cold sharper than any frostbite. I scanned the ridgeline, the skeletal trees rising like black scars against the fog, but there was nothing. No footprints except my own. No movement among the pines. Only the endless white, so still it felt as if the whole forest was holding its breath. And yet, someone had bled here. Recently. The question dug deeper, gnawing at the back of my skull. If it wasn't mine, if it wasn't Peter's, then whose? I pressed the photograph tighter in my fist, my pulse hammering harder than it should have been. The girl's face seemed different now, the way she looked back at me from that worn paper, more distant, more knowing. Annie. Christmas, 1940. What was it Peters had whispered before he died? Her name, again and again, like a prayer. Or a warning. The sound drifted through the fog then, faint but unmistakable. The slow crunch of footsteps in the snow. Deliberate, measured. Not the erratic shuffle of the wounded, but steady, confident, drawing closer from somewhere beyond the ridge. I froze, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the tree line. The sound stopped. Silence closed in once more, thick and pressing. And then they appeared. Figures emerging from the mist, half-formed shadows against the pale white, moving with a terrible slowness as though the frost itself resisted them. At first, I thought they were soldiers, some lost patrol, maybe Germans retreating through the storm, but there was no glint of helmets, no rifles slung low across their backs. They were dressed wrong, too thin, the coats hanging loose, shapeless. In their faces, pale as the snow, empty of color, features blurred as if the frost was still clinging to them. They stopped just shore of the ridge, close enough that I could see the frost coating their hair, the way their breath didn't fog the air. And in that unbearable silence, one of them raised a hand. Not a threat, a gesture. Beckoning. I wanted to move, wanted to raise my rifle, to speak, to do anything but kneel there like a man already dead. But I couldn't. The weight of the photograph in my hand felt heavier now, the blood seeping slowly into the edges. And then, as the wind shifted, I realized the blood wasn't coming from the snow. It was seeping from the photograph itself. The girl's smile, Annie's smile, had begun to darken, her pale lips bleeding into the frostbitten paper as though the image itself were unraveling. I dropped it, my breath catching, heart pounding so loud it filled my skull. The figures at the ridge remained still, waiting, and then one of them whispered my name. Not shouted, not spoken. Whispered, close. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled for logic, but was slipping, unraveling with every passing second. How could they know my name? I hadn't spoken it aloud in days, and certainly not in the presence of anyone but Peters. But there it was again, that faint whisper, soft, like a breeze moving through the trees, but it was clear, unmistakable, almost personal. Jack. The world shifted. For the briefest moment, the snow around me seemed to dim, the edges of my vision turning to a pale gray. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it all. The figures hadn't moved, not yet, but the air felt different, thick, weighted down, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath with me. Their eyes, those hollow, glassy eyes, were fixed on me, and the longer I looked, the more it felt like they were not merely watching. They were waiting. Something inside me twisted. I wanted to run, to grab my rifle, to do anything but stay there, staring at them like a fool. But my legs were heavy, frozen in place, as if the earth beneath me had claimed me as its own. I could hear my pulse in my ears now, loud and frantic, drowning out everything else. But the whisper came again, a little louder this time. Jack. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if it was some cruel trick of the mind, a fevered hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion, but I couldn't escape it. The sound was pulling me toward them. And despite the gnawing fear, despite the icy dread creeping up my spine, a part of me, some foolish, desperate part, wanted to go to them, to understand, to see why they were there and what it was that had kept them in the fog. One of them stepped forward, the movement so slow, so deliberate, as though time itself had been around them. Their face, still obscured by the shifting mist, was almost familiar. The pale skin, the hollow cheeks, a face I had once known, once loved, long ago, but distorted now, like a reflection in cracked glass. Annie, the words slipped from my mouth before I could stop it, the syllables tasting like ash in my throat. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as though considering me. The breath that came from its mouth was visible in the air, a cloud of mist that hung in the stillness for a moment before it dissipated into the snow. The fog around us thickened, swirling like something alive, and it felt as though the world were collapsing into this one moment, this one terrible intersection of memory and madness. For a second, I saw her, Annie, in the figure's place, her eyes wide and unblinking, standing just beyond the mist, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. I reached for her, my hand shaking, but the moment she moved, the fog swallowed her up, and the figure was there again, standing silently, waiting. Why? The word came out in a hoarse rasp. "Why are you here?" The figure did not answer. Instead, its lips parted, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as it spoke. Not to me, but into the silence around us, the words strange and twisted, almost in a language I didn't understand. It was like listening to a chant, something ancient and broken, something that didn't belong in the world of men. The words faded into the wind, and for a long moment, nothing stirred, nothing moved. The forest was as still as death. Then, with a sound like cracking ice, one of the other figures stepped forward. The air thickened around them, the temperature plummeting once more, as if they had brought the cold with them. The one in the center raised its hand again, and I knew, without understanding how, that this was the moment where everything would change. They were reaching for me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't run. I couldn't. My body refused to obey, frozen in the grip of something far worse than fear. They came closer, and I felt it, the weight of their presence pressing down on me. The whispering voices, all of them speaking together now, growing louder in the mist, echoing in my mind like 1,000 lost souls. "Jack." And then, just as quickly as they had come, the figures stopped. They stood there motionless, as though waiting for something that only they understood. The air crackled, as if the world itself were on the edge of breaking apart, and in that moment, I realized what they were waiting for. It wasn't me. It was the land beneath us, the earth, the snow. There. It was the end of everything that had come before. And with that, the first of them turned, slowly, deliberately, and began to walk away, vanishing into the fog without a trace. The others followed, their forms dissipating as they blended into the storm. I didn't move. I couldn't. I only watched as they disappeared, leaving me alone in the growing silence. The fog was lifting now, the cold biting into my skin, and for the first time, I understood. The war wasn't just out there, beyond the ridge, beyond the trenches. It wasn't just in the bodies that lay frozen in the snow. It was here too, deep within the land, buried under layers of ice and blood. And whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And then, far off in the distance, I heard it again. The faint whisper of a voice. Not a man, not a soldier, but something older, something that had been waiting. "Jack." I turned my back to the ridge, not knowing if I was running towards salvation or deeper into the heart of something far worse than death itself. I took a step back, my boots crunching in the snow, and for a brief moment, the ground beneath me felt less like solid earth and more like something shifting. The fog rolled in thicker now, cloaking everything in an almost unnatural stillness. The sound of my breath was too loud in my ears, and for a second, I thought I could still hear the whispers, faint, distant, but unmistakable, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. I shook my head, trying to clear it. The chill in the air, the bite of frost against my skin, it was real. All of it was real. But the figures, they hadn't been men, not in any true sense. They'd been something else. A vision, a warning, a curse. Maybe they had been ghosts, but their presence felt deeper than that. They felt ancient. Like they had existed long before the war and would continue to exist long after it was over. I glanced down at the dog tags I still clutched in my hand. The weight of them, cold and heavy, grounded me in the here and now. Peter's name was etched into the metal, the edges worn smooth from years of use. His death had felt inevitable, like it was always coming, but this was different. This was something I couldn't explain away. It wasn't just the war anymore. It wasn't just bullets and bloodshed. It was the land itself, the cold that gnawed at your bones, the whispers in the wind. I moved forward, instinct driving me, but my legs felt stiff, like they were made of stone, dragging behind me with every step. The world had taken on a strange, dreamlike quality, like I was trapped in some fevered hallucination. The trees around me seemed to lean in, their twisted branches reaching toward me like fingers, and the ground felt uneven beneath my feet, as though it were buckling, shifting with every movement. The forest stretched out before me, and the storm raged on above. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It wasn't just nature at work anymore. It was something older, something that had been here long before men ever set foot on this land. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by soldiers, not by Germans or Americans, but by something far older, something that had claimed this place long before the war had started. I stumbled through the snow, pushing myself forward, my breath ragged and shallow. Every inch of my body screamed for warmth, for rest, for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. No shelter. No safety. Just the endless, suffocating cold and the shadows that crept in from every corner of the world. And then I heard it again. The whisper. So close this time that I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain it was right behind me. Jack. I spun around, rifle raised instinctively, but there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the endless expanse of white, the same cold, empty landscape. I lowered the rifle slowly, my hands shaking, and tried to steady my breath. Had I lost my mind? Or was there something out there with me? There were no answers. Only silence. Only the wind that howled through the trees, like the earth itself was crying out. I moved forward again, faster this time, the fear driving me now. Fear of what I'd seen. Fear of what I hadn't seen. And then, just as I reached the edge of the forest, I stopped. A figure stood in the distance, just beyond the tree line, staring at me. At first, I thought it was one of the soldiers. But the figure wasn't moving. Not even a twitch. It was standing so still, so unnaturally still, that it sent a ripple of panic through me. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was obscured by the snowstorm. And then it moved. It was a sudden, jerking motion, like a puppet yanked on invisible strings. And just like that, it was gone. Vanished into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. I took a step forward, then another, my feet heavy in the snow, but the figure didn't reappear. It was as if it had never been there at all. I wasn't sure what was worse, that it had been real or that it hadn't. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. But the fog closed in around me again, thick and suffocating. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. The cold was unbearable, and every breath felt like a knife slicing into my chest. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the voice once more. Clearer than before, echoing in my mind like a call to the very core of me. Jack. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. I turned, and I saw her, standing there in the mist. She was no longer a blur, no longer a figure lost in a storm. She was clear, her features sharp, her eyes filled with a strange light. She was real, and she was waiting for me. I took a step toward her. And then, as if the earth itself had rebelled, the ground beneath me gave way. The last thing I saw was her face, her smile, before the darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness was all-consuming, and for a moment I thought I might have been dead. My body felt weightless, suspended in a black void. The cold, the biting cold of the Ardennes was gone, replaced by an oppressive warmth that clung to my skin like sweat, thick and suffocating. There was no sound, no movement. Just the endless, crushing nothingness. Then slowly, the world began to come back into focus, the edges of the darkness stretching, pulling apart like the opening of a wound. I could feel the cold again, creeping back into my bones, but it was different now. This cold didn't bite. It wrapped itself around me, settling into my skin, as though I had been marked by something far older than any human battle. I opened my eyes, if I'd even closed them, and found myself lying in snow once more. The sharpness of it cut through the haze in my mind, pulling me back to reality, back to the world that had betrayed me. I pushed myself up, my hands sinking deep into the snow, my body shaking as if it had been taken apart and put back together wrong. I was on the edge of the forest. I knew it without having to look. The trees stood silent like sentinels, watching, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I knew it was impossible. The snow around me was untouched, pristine, but for one thing, there was no blood, no red stain, no trace of the figures I had seen. Only the pale whiteness of the Ardennes, empty and cold, stretching out in every direction. And then I heard it. A voice. But it wasn't a whisper this time. It was a call, echoing through the mist. A voice I knew. Jack. I turned sharply, my body moving before my mind could catch up. She was standing there again, and her face as clear as it had been before, but this time there was something different. Her eyes weren't filled with light or warmth. They were empty, hollow, and her smile, the same smile I had once known so well, was no longer comforting. It was sad, almost mournful. The fog swirled around her, thickening with every breath I took. I reached out to her, my hands trembling. Hey. She didn't respond. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Just the air, thick and cold, hanging between us. Something was wrong. I took a step toward her, but she didn't move. The distance between us felt infinite now, like the very ground beneath me was stretching further away with every step I took. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to ask what had happened, but my legs felt like stone. They wouldn't obey me. Annie, I repeated, my voice hoarse, desperate. Please, where are you? Her eyes, once full of life, seemed to flicker with a strange understanding, a deep sorrow that made my chest tighten. She began to fade, her form blurring like mist in the wind, her smile vanishing into the fog. Jack. And then she was gone. I stood there in the snow, breath coming in ragged gasps, as the mist swallowed her up, leaving me alone again. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, I realized that I didn't know where I was. The war was distant now, forgotten. The enemy, the cold, the hunger, none of it mattered. I was trapped in this place, in this moment, with no way out. And then, deep in the distance, I heard the sound of marching. The soft thump of boots in the snow. It was slow at first, barely perceptible, but as it drew closer, it became louder, more distinct. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to look, didn't want to face whatever was coming, but I couldn't help it. The figures emerged from the fog, just as they had before. Not soldiers, not men, but something else. Their faces, pale and expressionless, were obscured by the swirling mist, their movements slow, deliberate. Their eyes, empty like the void, fixed on me. They came closer, closer still, until the lead figure stopped in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from this nightmare, but my legs refused to move. The figure raised its hand, not in threat, but in greeting. Jack. The voice came from behind the figure, faint but familiar. It was hers again, Annie. And just like that, the world snapped. The mist closed in, the trees stretched out into endless darkness, and the soldiers, those strange, twisted soldiers, faded into the nothingness, leaving me standing alone again. Except for one thing. The ground beneath me shifted again. Something was moving, something alive, and it wasn't me. And as the earth cracked open around me, I understood. This was no longer a place of war. This wasn't the Ardennes I had known. This was something else. Something older. And it was waiting for me.